Empire and national identity. Great Britain during Victoria's reign was not just a powerful island nation. It was the center of a global empire that brought the British into contact with a wide variety of other cultures, though the exchange was usually an unequal one. By the end of the 19th century, nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface was part of the British Empire, and more than 400 million people were governed, however nominally, from Great Britain. Queen Victoria's far-flung empire was a truly heterogeneous entity, controlled by heterogeneous practices. It included crown colonies such as Jamaica, ruled from Britain, and protectorates such as Uganda, which had relinquished only partial sovereignty to Britain. Ireland was a kind of internal colony whose demands for home rule were alternately entertained and discounted. India had started the century under the control of a private entity, the East India Company, but was ruled directly from Britain after the 1857 Indian Mutiny, the First War of Indian Independence, and Victoria was crowned Empress of India in 1877. Canada, with its substantial European population, had been virtually self-governing from the middle of the 19th century onward and was increasingly considered a near-equal partner in the imperial project. Australia enjoyed a parallel status, despite its inauspicious earlier history as the site of British penal colonies. By contrast, colonies and protectorates with large indigenous populations, such as Sierra Leone, or with large transplanted populations of ex-slaves and non-European laborers, such as Trinidad, would not gain autonomy until the 20th century. The scope of imperial enterprise at the close of the Victorian era is especially astounding given Britain's catastrophic loss of its American colonies. Historians generally view the American revolution of 1776 as marking the end of the First British Empire. But although empire was never a central preoccupation of the government during the first half of the 19th century, the Second Empire had continued to grow. Britain acquired a number of new territories, greatly expanded its colonies in Australia and Canada, which saw large-scale British emigration, and steadily pushed its way across the Indian subcontinent. A far more rapid expansion took place between 1870 and 1900, 3 decades that witnessed the new imperialism, a significantly different British mode of empire building that would continue until World War I, 1914-18. Britain's rivalry with its European neighbors was an instrumental factor. The balance of power in Europe had shifted in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, leading to competition for new territories. Particularly fierce was the scramble for Africa, as the partitioning of that continent was called. Expansion did not go unchallenged. The British fought both with indigenous peoples and with other European powers or settlers in numerous conflicts, but it progressed at an astonishing pace nonetheless. To summarize Britain's attitude toward its imperial activities over the centuries is no easy task. The historian Sir John Seeley famously remarked in The Expansion of England, 1883, that we seem, as it were, to have conquered and peopled half the world in a tit of absence of mind, but many would now argue that economic motives were always present, and that Britain was driven to claim territories outside its national borders primarily by the urge to obtain raw materials such as sugar, spices, tea, tin, and rubber, to procure markets for its own goods, and to secure trade routes. From this perspective, Britain's enhanced national pride in its expanding physical size, and thus ever-increasing political and military clout, was an important side effect of commercial growth but did not instigate its exploits overseas. To look at the British Empire in this way is to see it at its most naked, and to confront head-on the desire for financial profit that occasioned the physical violence and cultural devastation that so often accompanied its arrival in, and occupation of, another land. As Marlowe comments in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1902, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. But Conrad's storyteller cannot leave it at that, adding, what redeems it is the idea only. As we try to understand, if not redeem, the British Empire, we must investigate some of the principal ideas that collected around this huge and diverse phenomenon, and that underwent significant shifts over the decades of Victoria's reign. Joseph Chamberlain asserts in The True Conception of Empire, 1897, that the balance sheet dictated what early 19th century Britons thought about their relationship with the colonies, having in the previous century appeared rather in the light of a grasping and absentee landlord desiring to take from his tenants the utmost rents he could exact. Britain, shaken by its American losses, worried that some of its overseas enterprises would prove a financial drain. Yet India was another story, and by 1800 the importance to British prosperity of the trading opportunities in that continent was already viewed as axiomatic. In managing its businesses, however, the East India Company grew progressively more entangled with issues of Indian administration and politics. In its turn, the British government became increasingly concerned with overseeing, and ultimately taking over, these functions. From this state of affairs a notion of trusteeship began to emerge, a belief that Britain had the responsibility to provide good government for the Indian people. Underlying this conviction was the assumption that Britain would thereby bestow the benefits of its culturally and morally superior civilization upon a lesser people. Thomas Babington Macaulay's confident pronouncements in his 1835 Minute on Indian Education evince the sentiment with particular succinctness. Evangelical Christianity played a contributory role as well, and not just through the missionaries who worked in India beginning in the early 19th century. More broadly, for the majority of Britons, who believed that Protestantism was the one true faith, and that it was their religious duty to bring the potential for salvation to as many souls as possible, the imposition of British rule was divinely sanctioned. But there was still no widespread popular or governmental enthusiasm for the idea of imperialism as Britain's special destiny, and various factors, not least England's long and troubled relationship with Ireland, ensured that many viewed the project of colonial rule with suspicion throughout the middle years of the century. With the rise of the new imperialism, however, pre-existing ideas about Britain's superiority, now bolstered by supposedly scientific theories supporting the notion of its evolutionary advancement, were channeled into a romantic vision of the British Empire as a tremendous force for the good not only of the residents of Great Britain or those overseas of traditionally British descent but of the whole world. In the last 3 decades of Victoria's rule and well into the 20th century, a large proportion of British people took pride simultaneously in the global supremacy of their empire and in what they perceived to be their generous and selfless willingness to pick up the thankless, but necessary, task of imperial rule, the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling would call it in another context. Only if we appreciate just how genuinely many Britons believed that they and their country were performing a noble duty can we begin to make sense of the feelings of outrage, surprise and betrayal, often accompanied by virulent racism and vicious reprisals, that erupted when subjugated peoples periodically rose up against British control. The British Empire had an incalculable physical and psychological impact on the individuals and cultures it colonized, but it also significantly changed the colonizers themselves, both at home and abroad. The need to concentrate on the imperial misdesign affected in theoretical and practical ways the consolidation of a specifically British identity, the conflicted relations and characteristic differences between people from the various parts of the British Isles, politically dominant England and long-conquered Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, appeared less significant when set against the much more obvious inequities of power and greater cultural, racial, religious, and linguistic differences across the globe. A number of similar processes worked to solidify nationhood more generally. For instance, members of the working class in Great Britain only rarely connected their subordination to the English ruling class with that suffered by colonized peoples. They were much more likely to understand their identity through those ties of kindred, of religion, of history, and of language, as Chamberlain puts it, that bound them to other historically British citizens, however privileged. Intensified competition with the empire-building powers of continental Europe after the Franco-Prussian War also played an important role, as did the mounting stridency of other nationalist movements abroad. In the last quarter of the century, the patriotic fervor celebrating the achievements of the British nation as a whole increased dramatically, a phenomenon undoubtedly assisted by the growth both in the size of the reading public. Literacy was practically universal in Britain by 1900, thanks to the progressive extension of elementary education, and in the number of flag-waving newspapers, periodicals, and books available for it to consume. The citizens of Great Britain were thus welded into a more cohesive whole. But two of them were ready to accept the peoples of the colonies, and especially indigenous non-white populations, as truly British, despite the inclusive rhetoric of empire, the one imperial whole that Alfred, Lord Tennyson salutes in his poem on the opening of the Indian and Colonial Exhibition of 1886. Of course, there were exceptions. Recounting his experiences on a visit to Britain for that same exhibition, the Indian T. N. Mukherjee remembers that on one occasion in London, somebody called me a foreigner. He is no foreigner, cried several voices. He is a British subject as you and I. To J. A. Hobson, the author of The Influential Imperialism, a Study, 1902, the importance of this casual affirmation of shared subjecthood was negligibly, given that not 5% of the population of our empire are possessed of any appreciable portion of the political and civil liberties which are the basis of British civilization. Writing after Britain's imperial confidence had been severely damaged by the unanticipated length and difficulty of the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902 in South Africa, Hobson in his meticulous analysis aimed not only to cast serious doubt on imperialism's putative financial benefit to Britain but also to demonstrate the overall falsity of the empire's claim to support the extension of self-government in its territories. In exposing the repeated misrepresentations and self-serving justifications at the heart of the British Empire, Hobson joined voices with others around the globe, such as the West Indian intellectual J. J. Thomas, and entered a tradition of anti-imperial critique that was to grow exponentially in the 20th century. It is instructive to consider the following discussions of Britain's relationship with other parts of the world, and its understanding of its own identity, in the context of a number of other selections. The popularity of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Regatta of Omar Khayyam, 1859, testifies to the Victorians' fascination with what they saw as the exotic appeal of distant cultures. Tennyson's poem Locksley Hall, 1842, also reflects on yonder shining Orient. Matthew Arnold's prose ratings frequently address the issue of national character, while John Henry Newman sets forth an ideal of English manliness in his definition of a gentleman in Discourse 8 of the Idea of a City, 1852. Versions of this ideal from the apex of Great Britain's period of national pride appear in two highly popular poems, W. E. Henley's Invictus, 1888, and Kipling's If, 1910. Kipling's other poems and his novella The Man Who Would Be King, 1888, are also essential reading for those interested in the intensification of imperial enthusiasm at the end of Victoria's reign. At the same time we should heed the warning of the post-colonial critic Gayatri Spivak against limiting any investigation of empire and national identity only to those writings that seem overtly concerned with the topic. It should not be possible to read 19th century British literature, she insists at the beginning of an analysis of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, without remembering that imperialism, understood as England's social mission, was a crucial part of the cultural representation of England to the English. In other words, images, explanations, and justifications of this massive enterprise were continually created and reflected throughout the pages of a wide range of Victorian texts. Thomas Babington Macaulay, the historian, essayist, and parliamentarian Macaulay, 1818-59, served as ME member of the Supreme Council of the East India Company from 1834 to 1838, and in that capacity he oversaw major educational and legal reforms. His minute, or official memorandum, was written to rebut those council members who believed that Indian students should continue to be educated in Sanskrit and Persian as well as in English. Macaulay's party carried the argument. From Minute on Indian Education. We now come to the gist of the matter. We have a fund to be employed as government shall direct for the intellectual improvement of the people of this country. The simple question is, what is the most useful way of employing it? All parties seem to be agreed on one point, that the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literary or scientific information, and are, moreover, so poor and rude that, until they are enriched from some other quarter, it will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them. It seems to be admitted on all sides that the intellectual improvement of those classes of the people who have the means of pursuing higher studies can at present be effected only by means of some language not vernacular amongst them. What, then, shall that language be? One half of the committee maintain that it should be the English. The other half strongly recommend the Arabic and Sanskrit. The whole question seems to me to be, which language is the best worth knowing? I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translations of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit works. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. Am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is, indeed, fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. It will hardly be disputed, I suppose, that the department of literature in which the Eastern writers stand highest is poetry. And I certainly never met with any Orientalist who ventured to maintain that the Arabic and Sanskrit poetry could be compared to that of the great European nations. But, when we pass from works of imagination to works in which facts are recorded and general principles investigated, the superiority of the Europeans becomes absolutely immeasurable. It is, I believe, no exaggeration to say, that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgments used at preparatory schools in England. In every branch of Physical or moral philosophy, the relative position of the two nations is nearly the same. How, then, stands the case? We have to educate a people who cannot at present be educated by means of their mother tongue. We must teach them some foreign language. The claims of our own language it is hardly necessarily to recapitulate. It stands preeminent even among the languages of the West. It abounds with works of imagination not inferior to the noblest which Greece has bequeathed to us, with models of every species of eloquence, with historical compositions, which, considered merely as narratives, have seldom been surpassed, and which, considered as vehicles of ethical and political instruction, have never been equaled, with just and lively representations of human life and human nature, with the most profound speculations on metaphysics, morals, government, jurisprudence, and trade, with full and correct information respecting every experimental science which tends to preserve the health, to increase the comfort, or to expand the intellect of man. Whoever knows that language, has ready access to all the vast intellectual wealth, which all the wisest nations of the earth have created and hoarded in the course of 90 generations. It may safely be said that the literature now extant in that language is of far greater value than all the literature which 300 years ago was extant in all the languages of the world spoken together. Nor is this all. In India, English is the language spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken by the higher class of natives at the seats of government. It is likely to become the language of commerce throughout the seas of the East. It is the language of two great European communities which are rising, the one in the south of Africa, the other in Australasia, communities which are every year becoming more important, and more closely connected with our Indian Empire. Whether we look at the intrinsic value of our literature or at the particular situation of this country, we shall see the strongest reason to think that, of all foreign tongues, the English tongue is that which would be the most useful to our native subjects. It is said that the Sanskrit and Arabic are the languages in which the sacred books of 100 millions of people are written, and that they are, on that account, entitled to peculiar encouragement. Assuredly it is the duty of the British government in India to be not only tolerant, but neutral on all religious questions, but to encourage the study of a literature admitted to be of small intrinsic value only because that literature inculcates the most serious errors on the most important subjects, is a course hardly reconcilable with reason, with morality, or even with that very neutrality which ought, as we all agree, to be sacredly preserved. It is confessed that a language is barren of useful knowledge. We are told to teach it because it is fruitful of monstrous superstitions. We are to teach false history, false astronomy, false medicine, because we find them in company with a false religion. In one point I fully agree with the gentlemen to whose general views I am opposed. I feel, with them, that it is impossible for us, with our limited means, to attempt to educate the body of the people. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. 1835. William Howard Russell. One of the first war correspondents, the Irish-born Russell, 1820–1907, became famous for his dispatches to the London Times during the Crimean War, 1854–56, and later reported on the American Civil War, 1861–65. After the outbreak of the Indian Mutiny, 1857–59, a rebellion of native troops and peasantry, later referred to in India as the First War of Indian Independence, Russell traveled to northern India to report on the revolt's suppression by British troops. More sympathetic toward the Indians than most Victorians, Russell debunked many of the most shocking rumors about the rape, torture, and killing of British people and criticized the cruelty of indiscriminate British reprisals. In the following excerpts he reflects on the fate of the British community at Conbury, which surrendered to the Indian rebels and was subsequently massacred. From my diary in India, in the year 18,589. Conbury. February 12. The scenes where great crimes have been perpetrated ever possess an interest, which I would not undertake to stigmatize as morbid, and surely among the sites rendered infamous for all time, Conbury will be preeminent as the magnitude of the atrocities with which it is connected. But, though preeminent among crimes, the massacre of Conbury is by no means singular or unprecedented in any of the circumstances which mark turpitude and profundity of guilt. We who suffered from it think that there never was such wickedness in the world, and the incessant efforts of a gang of forgers and utterers of lies have surrounded it with horrors needlessly invented in the hope of adding to the indignation and burning desire for vengeance which the naked facts aroused. Helpless garrisons, surrendering under capitulation, have been massacred ere now. Men, women, and children have been ruthlessly butchered by the enemies of their race ere now. Risings, such as that of the people of Pontus under Mithridates, of the Irish Roman Catholics against the Protestant settlers in 1641, of the actors in the Sicilian Vespers, of the assassins who smote and spared none on the eve of St. Bartholomew, have taken place before, and have been over and over again, attended by inhuman cruelty, violation, and torture. The history of medieval Europe affords many instances of crimes as great as those of Conbury. The history of civilized nations could afford some parallel to them even in modern times. In fact, the peculiar aggravation of the Conbury massacres was this, that the deed was done by a subject race by black men who dared to shed the blood of their masters and mistresses, and to butcher poor helpless ladies and children, who were the women and offspring of the dominant and conquering people. Here we had not only a civil war and a sort of jacquerie three combined, but we had a war of religion, a war of race, a war of revenge, mingled together in a contest in which the insurgents were also actuated by some national promptings to shake off the yoke of a stranger, and to re-establish the full power of native chiefs, and the full sway of native religions. There is a kind of God's revenge against murder in the unsuccessful issue of all enterprises commenced in massacre, and carried on by cruelty and bloodshed. Whatever the causes of the mutiny and the revolt, it is clear enough that one of the modes by which the leaders, as if by common instinct, determined to effect their end was the destruction of every white man, woman, or child who fell into their hands, a design which the kindliness of the people, or motives of policy, frustrated on many remarkable occasions. It must be remembered that the punishments of the Hindu are cruel, and whether he be mild or not, he certainly is not, any more than the Mussulman distinguished for clemency towards his enemies. But philosophize and theorize as we may, Conbury will be a name ever heard by English ears with horror long after the present generation has passed away. February 13th. The difficulty, in my mind, was to believe that Cawnpore could ever have been defended at all. Make every allowance for the effects of weather, for circumstances, it is still the most wretched defensive position that could be imagined. Honor to those who defended it. Pity for their fate. Above all, pity for the lot of those whom the strong arms and brave hearts failed to save from the unknown dangers of that foul treachery. It was a horrible spot. Inside the shattered rooms, which had been the scene of such devotion and suffering, are heaps of rubbish and filth. The entrenchment is used as a cloaca maximified by the natives, camp followers, coolies, and others who bivouac in the sandy plains around it. The smells are revolting. Bows of gorged vultures sit with outspread wings on the moldering parapets, or perching clusters on the 2 or 3 leafless trees at the angle of the works by which we enter. I shot one with my revolver, and as the revolting creature disgorged its meal, twisting its bare black snake-like neck to and fro, I made a vow I would never incur the risk of beholding such a disgusting sight again. February 14th. All the country about Conbury is covered with the tiniest powdered dust, 2 or 3 inches deep, which rises into the air on the smallest provocation. It is composed of sand, pulverized earth, and the brick powder and mortar of the dilapidated houses, whatever, in fact, can turn into dust. As the natives shuffle along, their pointed slippers fling up suffocating clouds of this unpleasant compound, and when these slippers are multiplied by thousands, the air is filled with a floating stratum of it, 15 or 18 feet high, and extending over the whole of the station. Even in the old days, when the roads were watered, the station of Conbury had a bad notoriety for dust. What an earthquake to shake to pieces, what a volcano to smother with lava and ashes, has this mutiny been. Not alone cities, but confidence and trust have gone, never more to be restored. Among those heaps of dust and ashes, those arid mounds of brick, those new-made trenches, I try in vain to realize what was once the station of Con. 4. The solemn etiquette, the wisets to the brigadier and the general and grande tenue, the invitations to dinner, the white kid gloves, the balls, the liveries, the affectation of the plus haute houtstons, the millinery anxieties of the ladies, the ices, and champagne, and supper, the golden-robed Nana Sahib registered moving about amid haughty stares and ill-concealed dislike. What the deuce does the general ask that nigger here for? The little and big flirtations, the drives on the road, a dull, ceremonious pleasure, the faded fun of the private theatricals, the exotic absurdities of the Masonic revels, the marryings and givings in marriage, the little bills done by the rich bunnias, the small and great pecuniary relations between the station and the bazaar, the sense of security, and then on all this exaggerated relief of an English garrison town and watering place, the deep gloom of apprehension at first a shave of old Smiths, registered, then a well-authenticated report, then a certainty of disaffection rolling like thunderclouds, and darkening the glassy surface of the gay society till it burst on it in stormy and cruel reality. But I cannot. You should have seen Conbury in its palmy days, when there were 2 cavalry regiments here, a lot of artillery, and 3 regiments of infantry in the cantonments registered chock full of pretty women. The private theatricals every week, balls, and picnics, and dinners every evening. By Jove. It's too horrible to look at it now. And so, indeed, it was. But one is tempted to ask if there is not some lesson and some warning given to our race in reference to India by the tremendous catastrophe of Conbury. I am deeply impressed by the difficulty of ruling India, as it is now governed by force, exercised by a few who are obliged to employ natives as the instruments of coercion. That force is the base of our rule, I have no doubt, for I see nothing else but force employed in our relations with the governed. The efforts to improve the condition of the people are made by bodies or individuals who have no connection with the government. The action of the government in matters of improvement is only excited by conceit or at ions of revenue. Does it, as the great instructor of the people, the exponent of our superior morality and civilization, does it observe treaties, keep faith, pursue a fixed and equitable policy, and follow the precepts of Christianity in its conduct toward states and peoples? Are not our courts of law condemned by ourselves? Are not our police admitted to be a curse and a blight upon the country? In effect, the grave, unhappy doubt which settles on my mind is, whether India is the better for our rule, so far as regards the social condition of the great mass of the people. We have put down widow burning. We have sought to check infanticide, but I have traveled hundreds of miles through a country peopled with beggars and covered with wigwam villages. 1858-5 cent 9. Eliza Cook. A mainly self-educated poet of working-class origins, Cook, 1818-1889, published her first collection of verse when she was 17. Many of her poems, such as The Englishman, 1851, were widely popular. Beginning in 1849, Cook edited her own periodical, Eliza Cook's Journal, which proved a great success with her middle-class audience. Poor health forced her to discontinue publication of the journal in 1854, and in later life she produced far fewer poems than in her prolific youth. The Englishman. There's a land that bears a world-known name, though it is but a little spot. 5. Say 'tis first on the scroll of fame, and woe shall ever it is not. Of the deathless ones woe shine and live in arms, in arts, or song, the brightest the whole wide world can give to that little land belong. 'Tis the star of earth, deny it who can, the island home of an Englishman. There's a flag that waves o'er every sea, no matter when or where, and to treat that flag as aught but the tree is more than the strongest dare. For the lion spirits that tread the deck have carried the palm of the brave, and that flag may sink with a shot-torn wreck, but never float over a slave. Its honor is stainless, deny it who can, and this is the flag of an Englishman. There's a heart that leaps with burning glow, the wronged and the weak to defend, and strikes as soon for a trampled foe as it does for a soul-bound friend. It nurtures a deep and honest love, the passions of faith and pride, and burns with the fondness of a dove to the light of its own fireside. 'Tis a rich rough gem, deny it who can, and this is the heart of an Englishman. The Briton may traverse the pole or the zone and boldly claim his right, for he calls such a vast domain his own, that the sun never sets on his might. Let the haughty stranger seek to know the place of his home and birth, and a flush will pour from cheek to brow while he tells his native earth. For a glorious charter, deny it who can, is breathed in the words I'm an Englishman. 1851. Charles Mackay. A successful journalist and poet, Mackay, 1814-1889, also served for several years as the editor of the Illustrated London News. In the song collection The Emigrants, issued as a musical supplement to that periodical and frequently reprinted, Mackay focuses on emigration from Britain to Canada, a colony that had achieved self-governing status by the 1850s. During that decade, on average more than 300,000 people a year left the British Isles. These emigrants, large numbers of whom were fleeing poverty, hunger, and political upheaval in Ireland and Scotland, headed overwhelmingly to the United States and Canada. From The Emigrants. A series of songs for a musical entertainment. To cheer, boys. Cheer. I cheer, boys. Cheer. No more of idle sorrow, courage, true hearts, shall bear us on our way. Hope points before, and shows the bright tomorrow, let us forget the darkness of today. So farewell, England. Much as we may love thee, we'll dry the tears that we have shed before, why should we weep to sail in search of fortune? So farewell, England. Farewell evermore. Cheer, boys. Cheer. For England, Mother England. Cheer, boys. Cheer. The willing strong right hand, cheer, boys. Cheer. There's work for honest labor, cheer, boys. Cheer, in the new and happy land. Cheer, boys. Cheer. The steady breeze is blowing, to float us freely o'er the ocean's breast, the world shall follow in the track we're going, the star of empire glitters in the west. Here we had toil and little to reward it, but there shall plenty smile upon our pain, and ours shall be the mountain and the forest, and boundless prairies ripe with golden grain. Cheer, boys. Cheer. For England, Mother England. Cheer, boys. Cheer. United heart and hand, cheer, boys. Cheer. There's wealth for honest labor, cheer, boys. Cheer, in the new and happy land. 3 Far, far upon the sea. Far, far upon the sea, the good ship speeding free, upon the deck we gather young and old, and view the flapping sail, spreading out before the gale, full and round without a wrinkle or a fold, or watch the waves that glide by the stately vessel's side, and the wild seabirds that follow through the air. Or we gather in a ring, and with cheerful voices sing, oh. Gaily goes the ship when the wind blows fair. Too far, far upon the sea, with the sunshine on our lee degree we talk of pleasant days when we were young, and remember, though we roam, the sweet melodies of home, the songs of happy childhood which we sung. And though we quit her shore, to return to it no more, sound the glories that Britannia yet shall bear, that Britons rule the waves, and never shall be slaves 1-0. Gaily goes the ship when the wind blows fair. Ill far, far upon the sea, whate'er our country be, the thought of it shall cheer us as we go. And Scotland's sons shall join, in the song of Auld Lang Syne. With voice by memory softened, clear, and low, and the men of Erin's Isle degree battling sorrow with a smile, shall sing St. Patrick's morning, 3 void of care, and thus we pass the day as we journey on the way, oh. Gaily goes the ship when the wind blows fair. Anonymous. In 1845 potato blight severely damaged the crop in Ireland. Its return over the next several years caused widespread famine and disease, killing 1.5 million people and leading another million to emigrate. The British government's wholly inadequate response to the famine, which included exporting grain from Ireland while Irish people starved, contributed to the long-standing bitterness against British rule. Some came together in 1858 to advocate the use of force to liberate Ireland, taking their name from a group of legendary Irish warriors. They called themselves the Fenians, or Irish Republican Brotherhood, forerunners of the Irish Republican Army. Often thwarted by British infiltration of their ranks, the Fenians organized a rebellion in March 1867 that the British easily quelled. The Nation, a newspaper established in 1842 to promote Irish self-government, published the following statement around the time of that uprising. Proclamation of an Irish Republic. The Irish people to the world. We have suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, and bitter misery. Our rights and liberties have been trampled on by an alien aristocracy, who, treating us as foes, usurped our lands, and drew away from our unfortunate country all material riches. The real owners of the soil were removed to make room for cattle, and driven across the ocean to seek the means of living, and the political rights denied to them at home, while our men of thought and action were condemned to loss of life and liberty. But we never lost the memory and hope of a national existence. We appealed in vain to the reason and sense of justice of the dominant powers. Our mildest remonstrances were met with sneers and contempt. Our appeals to arms were always unsuccessful. Today, having no honorable alternative left, we again appeal to force as our last resource. We accept the conditions of appeal, manfully deeming it better to die in the struggle for freedom than to continue an existence of utter serfdom. All men are born with equal rights, and in associating to protect one another and share public burdens, justice demands that such associations should rest upon a basis which maintains equality instead of destroying it. We therefore declare that, unable longer to endure the curse of monarchical government, we aim at founding a republic based on universal suffrage, which shall secure to all the intrinsic value of their labor. The soil of Ireland, at present in the possession of an oligarchy, belongs to us, the Irish people, and to us it must be restored. We declare, also, in favor of absolute liberty of conscience, and the complete separation of church and state. We appeal to the highest tribunal for evidence of the justness of our cause. History bears testimony to the intensity of our sufferings, and we declare, in the face of our brethren, that we intend no war against the people of England. Our war is against the aristocratic locusts, whether English or Irish, who have eaten the verdure of our fields, against the aristocratic leeches who drain alike our fields and theirs. Republicans of the entire world, our cause is your cause. Our enemy is your enemy. Let your hearts be with us. As for you, workmen of England, it is not only your hearts we wish, but your arms. Remember the starvation and degradation brought to your firesides by the oppression of labor. Remember the past, look well to the future, and avenge yourselves by giving liberty to your children in the coming struggle for human liberty. Herewith we proclaim the Irish Republic, the Provisional Government. 1867. Matthew Arnold. The following selection comes from a series of lectures on Celtic literature delivered by Arnold, 1820-1888, in his capacity as professor of poetry at Oxford. Historically, the Celts were an ancient people who settled in Europe. Their linguistic descendants survived in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Like many of his contemporaries, Arnold thought that national character was determined by race. As the critic Lionel Trilling remarks in his 1949 study of the British writer, Arnold was at pains to show that the English are an amalgam of several bloods: German, Norman, Celtic, each of which carried its own special characteristics and required the balance of the other components that made up English identity. At the end of his lectures, Arnold called on Oxford University to create a professorship of Celtic to send a message of peace to Ireland. From On the Study of Celtic Literature. And as in material civilization he has been ineffectual, so has the Celt been ineffectual in politics. This colossal, impetuous, adventurous wanderer, the titan of the early world, who in primitive times fills so large a place on earth's scene, dwindles and dwindles as history goes on, and at last is shrunk to what we now see him. For ages and ages the world has been constantly slipping, ever more and more, out of the Celts' grasp. They went forth to the war, Ossian says most truly, but they always fail one. And yet, if one sets about constituting an ideal genius, what a great deal of the Celt does one find oneself drawn to put into it. Of an ideal genius one does not want the elements, any of them, to be in a state of weakness. On the contrary, one wants all of them to be in the highest state of power, but with the law of measure, of harmony, presiding over the whole. So the sensibility too of the self, if everything else were not sacrificed to it, is a beautiful and admirable force. For sensibility, the power of quick and strong perception and emotion, is one of the very prime constituents of genius, perhaps its most positive constituent. It is to the soul what good senses are to the body, the grand natural condition of successful activity. Sensibility gives genius its materials. One cannot have too much of it, if one can but keep its master and not be its slave. Do not let us wish that the self had had less sensibility, but that he had been more master of it. Even as it is, if his sensibility has been a source of weakness, to him, it has been a source of power too, and a source of happiness. Some people have found in the Celtic nature and its sensibility the main root out of which chivalry and romance and the glorification of a feminine ideal spring. This is a great question, with which I cannot deal here. Let me notice in passing, however, that there is, in truth, a Celtic air about the extravagance of chivalry, its reaction against the despotism of fact, its straining human nature further than it will stand. But putting all this question of chivalry and its origin on one side, no doubt the sensibility of the Celtic nature, its nervous exaltation, have something feminine in them, and the Celt is thus peculiarly predisposed to feel the spell of the feminine idiosyncrasy. He has an affinity to it, he is not far from its secret. Again, his sensibility gives him a peculiarly near and intimate feeling of nature and the life of nature. Here, too, he seems in a special way attracted by the secret before him, the secret of natural beauty and natural magic, and to be close to it, to have divine it. In the productions of the Celtic genius, nothing, perhaps, is so interesting as the evidences of this power. I shall have occasion to give specimens of them by and by. The same sensibility made the Celts full of reverence and enthusiasm for genius, learning, and the things of the mind. To be a bard, freed a man, that is a characteristic stroke of this generous and ennobling ardour of theirs, which no race has ever shown more strongly. Even the extravagance and exaggeration of the sentimental Celtic nature has often something romantic and attractive about it, something which has a sort of smack of misdirected good. The Celt, undisciplinable, anarchical, and turbulent by nature, but out of affection and admiration giving himself body and soul to some leader, that is not a promising political temperament, it is just the opposite of the Anglo-Saxon temperament, discipline. Able and steadily obedient within certain limits, but retaining an inalienable part of freedom and self-dependence, but it is a temperament for which one has a kind of sympathy notwithstanding. And very often, for the gay defiant reaction against fact of the lively Celtic nature one has more than sympathy, one feels, in spite of the extravagance, in spite of good sense disapproving, magnetized, and exhilarated by it. The Gauls had a rule inflicting a fine on every warrior who, when he appeared on parade, was found to stick out too much in front to be corpulent. In short, such a rule is surely the maddest article of war ever framed, and to people to whom nature has assigned a large volume of intestines, must appear, no doubt, horrible, but yet has it not an audacious, sparkling, immaterial manner with it, which lifts one out of routine, and sets one's spirits in a glow? All tendencies of human nature are in themselves vital and profitable. When they are blamed, they are only to be blamed relatively, not absolutely. This holds true of the Saxon's phlegm as well as of the Celt sentiment. Out of the steady humdrum habit of the creeping Saxon, as the Celt calls him, out of his way of going near the ground has come, no doubt, Philistinism. 5. That plant of essentially Germanic growth, flourishing with its genuine marks only in the German fatherland, Great Britain and her colonies, and the United States of America. But what a soul of goodness there is in Philistinism itself. And this soul of goodness I, who am often supposed to be Philistinism's mortal enemy merely because I do not wish it to have things all its own way, cherish as much as anybody. This steady-going habit leads at last, as I have said, up to science, up to the comprehension and interpretation of the world. With us in Great Britain, it is true, it does not seem to lead so far as that. It is in Germany, where the habit is more unmixed, that it can lead to science. Here with us it seems at a certain point to meet with a conflicting force, which checks it and prevents its pushing on to science, but before reaching this point what conquest has it not won? And all the more, perhaps, for stopping short at this point, for spending its exertions within a bounded field, the field of plain sense, of direct practical utility. How it has augmented the comforts and conveniences of life for us. Doors that open, windows that shut, locks that turn, razors that shave, coats that wear, watches that go, and 1,000 more such good things, are the invention of the Philistines. A label Arnold repeatedly used for the attitude of the unenlightened middle classes of his time, in whose opposition to the defenders of culture he sees a resemblance to the biblical tribe who fought against the people of Israel, the children of light. 1867. James Anthony Froude. The historian Froude, 1818-1894, came to fame as the author of a 12-volume History of England, 1856-70, and the biography of his mentor, Thomas Carlyle. 1882-1884, inspired by his visits to South Africa to explore other parts of the empire, he toured British possessions in the Caribbean in the winter of 1886-87 and there gathered information for the English in the West Indies, 1888, in which he expressed his belief that the colonies populated by non-white people were not suited to self-rule. In the following selection he focuses on his travels in Trinidad, a Caribbean island that passed from Spanish to British control near the end of the 18th century. From the English in the West Indies. Trinidad is not one of our oldest possessions, but we had held it long enough for the old planter civilization to take root and grow, and our road led us through jungles of flowering shrubs which were running wild over what had been once cultivated estates. Stranger still, for one associates colonial life instinctively with what is new and modern, we came at one place on an avenue of vast trees, at the end of which stood the ruins of a mansion of some great man of the departed order. Great man he must have been, for there was a gateway half crumbled away on which were his crest and shield in stone, with supporters on either side, like the Baron of Bradwardine's bears, fallen now like them, but unlike them never, I fear, to be set up again. The Anglo-West Indians, like the English gentry in Ireland, were a fine race of men in their day, and perhaps the improving them off the earth has been a less beneficial process in either case than we are in the habit of supposing. Entering among the hills we came on their successors. In Trinidad there are 18,000 freeholders, most of them Negroes and representatives of the old slaves. Their cabins are spread along the road on either side, overhung with breadfruit trees, tamarinds, calabash trees, out of which they make their cups and water jugs. The luscious granadilla climbs among the branches, plantains throw their cool shade over the doors, oranges and limes and citrons perfume the air, and droop their boughs under the weight of their golden burdens. There were yams in the gardens and cows in the paddocks, and cocoa bushes loaded with purple or yellow pods. Children played about in swarms, in happy idleness and abundance, with schools, too, at intervals, and an occasional Catholic chapel, for the old religion prevails in Trinidad, never having been disturbed. What form could human life assume more charming than that which we were now looking on? Once more, the earth does not contain any peasantry so well off, so well cared for, so happy, so sleek and contented as the sons and daughters of the emancipated slaves in the English West Indian Islands. Sugar may fail the planter, but cocoa, which each peasant can grow with small effort for himself, does not fail and will not. He may better his condition, if he has any such ambition, without stirring beyond his own ground, and so far, perhaps, his ambition may extend, if it is not turned off upon politics. Even the necessary evils of the tropics are not many or serious. His skin is proof against mosquitoes. There are snakes in Trinidad as there were snakes in Eden. Plenty snakes, said one of them who was at work in his garden, plenty snakes, but no bitey. As to costume, he would prefer the costume of innocence if he was allowed. Clothes in such a climate are superfluous for warmth, and to the minds of the Negroes, unconscious as they are of shame, superfluous for decency. We made several similar small expeditions into the settled parts of the neighborhood, seeing always, whatever else we saw, the boundless happiness of the black race. Under the rule of England in these islands, the 2 million of these poor brothers-in-law of ours are the most perfectly contented specimens of the human race to be found upon the planet. Even Schopenhauer, could he have known them, would have admitted that there were some of us who were not hopelessly wretched. If happiness be the satisfaction of every conscious desire, theirs is a condition which admits of no improvement. Were they independent, they might quarrel among themselves, and the weaker become the bondmen of the stronger. Under the beneficent despotism of the English government, which knows no difference of color and permits no oppression, they can sleep, lounge, and laugh away their lives as they please, fearing no danger. If they want money, work and wages are waiting for them. No one can say what may be before them hereafter. The powers which envy human beings to perfect felicity may find ways one day of disturbing the West Indian Negro, but so long as the English rule continues, he may be assured of the same tranquil existence. As life goes, he has been a lucky mortal. He was taken away from the home and Ashanti for to be a slave indeed, but a slave to a less cruel master than he would have found at home. He had a bad time of it occasionally, and the plantation whip and the branding irons are not all dreams, yet his owner cared for him at least as much as he cared for his cows and his horses. Kind usage to animals is more economical than barbarity, and Englishmen in the West Indies were rarely inhuman. Lord Rodney 5 says, I have been often in all the West India Islands, and I have often made my observations on the treatment of the Negro slaves, and can aver that I never knew the least cruelty inflicted on them, but that in general they live better than the honest day-laboring man in England, without doing a fourth part of his work in a day, and I am fully convinced that the Negroes in our islands are better provided for and 5 better than when in Guinea. 6 Rodney, it is true, was a man of facts and was defective in sentiment. Let us suppose him wrong, let us believe the worst horrors of the slave trade or slave usage as fluent tongue of missionary or demagogue has described them, yet nevertheless, when we consider what the lot of common humanity has been and is, we shall be dishonest if we deny that the balance has been more than redressed, and the Negroes who were taken away out of Africa, as compared with those who were left at home, were as they elect to salvation, 7 who after a brief purgatory are secured an eternity of blessedness. The one condition is the maintenance of the authority of the English crown. The whites of the islands cannot equitably rule them. They have not shaken off the old traditions. If, for the sake of theory or to shirk responsibility, we force them to govern themselves, the state of 88 stands as a ghastly example of the condition into which they will then inevitably fall. If we persist, we shall be sinning against light, the clearest light that was ever given in such affairs. The most hardened believers in the regenerating effects of political liberty cannot be completely blind to the ruin which the infliction of it would necessarily bring upon the race for whose interests they pretend particularly to care. 1888. John Jacob Thomas. Thomas, ca. 1840-1889, a descendant of slaves, was born into poverty on the Caribbean island of Trinidad. Primarily a self-educated intellectual, he became a linguist, folklorist, teacher, civil servant, editor, and author. His Fraudicity, 1889, is a spirited book-length rebuttal of James Anthony Fruit's English in the West Indies, 1888, challenging its assumptions about the inferiority of non-white people and exposing its mistakes and its misrepresentations of his native land. From Fraudacity. From Social Revolution. Never was the Knight of La Mancha more convinced of his imaginary mission to redress the wrongs of the world than Mr. James Anthony Fruit seems to be of his ability to alter the course of events, especially those bearing on the destinies of the Negro in the British West Indies. The doctrinaire style of his utterances, his sublime indifference as to what Negro opinion and feelings may be, on account of his revelations, are uniquely charming. In that portion of his book headed Social Revolution, our author, with that mixture of frankness and cynicism which is so dear to the soul of the British esprit fort of today, has challenged a comparison between British colonial policy on the one hand, and the colonial policy of France and Spain on the other. This he does with an evident recklessness that his approval of Spain and France involves a definite condemnation of his own country. However, let us hear him. The English West Indies, like other parts of the world, are going through a silent revolution. Elsewhere the revolution, as we hope, is a transition state, a new birth, a passing away of what is old and worn out, that a fresh and healthier order may rise in its place. In the West Indies the most sanguine OT mortals will find it difficult to entertain any such hope at all, as Mr. Fruit is speaking dogmatically here of /s, or rather our West Indies. Let us hear him as he proceeds. We have been a ruling power there for 250 years, the whites whom we planted as our representatives are drifting into ruin, and they regard England and England's policy as the principal cause of it. The blacks whom, in a fit of virtuous benevolence, we emancipated, do not feel particularly obliged to us. They think, if they think at all, that they were ill-treated originally, and have received no more than was due to them thus far. Now, as to the whites whom we planted as our representatives, and who, Mr. Fruit avers, are drifting into ruin, we confess to a total ignorance of their whereabouts in these islands in this jubilee year of Negro emancipation. OT the representatives of Britain immediately before and after emancipation we happen to know something, which, on the testimony of Englishmen, Mr. Fruit will be made quite welcome to before our task is ended. With respect to Mr. Fruit's statement as to the ingratitude of the emancipated blacks, if in 15 aimed at the slaves who were actually set free, it is utterly untrue, for no class of persons, in their humble and artless way, are more attached to the Queen's Majesty, whom they regard as incarnating in her gracious person the benevolence which Mr. Fruit so jauntily scoffs at. But if our censor's remark under this head is intended for the present generation of blacks, it is a pure and simple absurdity. What are we Negroes of the present day to be grateful for to the us, personified by Mr. Fruit and the Colonial Office exportations? We really believe, from what we know of Englishmen, that very few indeed would regard Mr. Fruit's reproach otherwise than as a palpable adding of insult to injury. Obliged to us, indeed. Why, Mr. Fruit, who speaks of us as dogs and horses, suggests that the same kindliness of treatment that secures the attachment of those noble brutes would have the same result in our case. With the same consistency that marks his utterances. Throughout his book, he tells his readers that there is no original or congenital difference between the capacity of the white and the Negro races. He adds, too, significantly, with the SWME chances and with the same treatment, I believe that distinguished men would be produced equally from both races. After this truthful testimony, which Pelion upon Asa asterisk of evidence has confirmed, does Mr. Fruit, in the fatuity of his skin pride, believe that educated men, worthy of the name, would be otherwise than resentful, if not disgusted, at being shunted out of bread in their own native land, which their parents' labors and taxes have made desirable, in order to afford room to blockheads, vulgarians, or worse, imported from beyond the seas? Does Mr. Fruit's scorn of the Negro skin extend, inconsistently on his part, to their intelligence and feelings also? And if so, what has the Negro to care if let alone and not wantonly thwarted in his aspirations? It sounds queer, not to say unnatural and scandalous, that Englishmen should in these days of light be the champions of injustice towards their fellow subjects, not for any intellectual or moral disqualification, but on the simple account of the darker skin of those who are to be assailed and thwarted in their life's career and aspirations. Really, are we to be grateful that the color difference should be made the basis and justification of the dastardly denials of justice, social, intellectual, and moral, which have characterized the regime of those who Mr. Fruit boasts were left to be the representatives of Britain's morality and fair play? 1889. Alfred, Lord Tennyson. In his capacity as Poet Laureate, Tennyson, 1809-1892, was invited by Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales and Queen Victoria's eldest son, to write a poem for the opening OT the Indian and Colonial Exhibition of 1886. It was one of numerous elaborately staged and popular events hosted by London after the success of the Great Exhibition in 1851 that made a spectacle of colonial products, crafts, and peoples for the British public. Tennyson's verses were set to music by Sir Arthur Sullivan, 1842-1900, and sung at the inaugural ceremony at the Albert Hall in the presence of the Queen. Opening of the Indian and Colonial Exhibition by the Queen. Written at the request of the Prince of Wales. Welcome, welcome with one voice. In your welfare we rejoice, sons and brothers that have sent, from isle and cape and continent, produce of your field and flood, mount and mine, and primal wood, works of subtle brain and hand, and splendors of the morning land degree gifts from every British zone. Britons, hold your own. 1. 2. May we find, as ages run, the mother featured in the sun, and may yours forever be that old strength and constancy which has made your fathers great in our ancient island state, and wherever her flag fly, glorying between sea and sky, makes the might of Britain known. Britons, hold your own. 3. Britain fought her sons of your Britain failed, and nevermore, careless of our growing kin, shall we sin our fathers' sin, men that in a narrower day unprophetic rulers they drove from out the mother's nest that young eagle of the west degree to forage for herself alone. Britons, hold your own. 4. Sharers of our glorious past, brothers, must we part at last? Shall we not through good and ill cleave to one another still? Britain's myriad voices call, sons, be welded each and all, into one imperial whole, one with Britain, heart, and soul. 41 life, one flag, one fleet, one throne. Britons, hold your own. 1886. T. N. Mukherjee. Trailokanath Mukherjee, a government official and Brahmin, a member of the highest Hindu caste, traveled to England with the Indian delegation for the Indian and Colonial Exhibition of 1886. On his return home his impressions of the trip were serialized in a weekly Indian newspaper, and then reprinted in a book published in London and Calcutta. In the following selection Mukherjee describes his experiences with, and observations of, the British. From a visit to Europe. The Indian and Colonial Exhibition. Another place of considerable interest to the natives of England was the Indian Bazaar where Hindu and Muhammadan artisans carried on their avukatayans, to witness which men, women, and children flocked from all parts of the kingdom. A dense crowd always stood there, looking at our men as they wove the gold brocade, sang the patterns of the carpet one and printed the calico with the hand. They were as much astonished to see the Indians produce works of art with the aid of rude apparatus they themselves had discarded long ago, as a Hindu would be to see a chimpanzee officiating as a priest in a funeral ceremony and reading out Sanskrit texts from a palm leaf book spread before him. We were very interesting beings no doubt, so were the Zulus before us, and so is the Sioux chief at the present time, 1887. Human nature everywhere thirsts for novelty, and measures out its favors in proportion to the rarity and oddity of a thing. It was from the ladies that we received the largest amount of patronage. We were pierced through and through by stares from eyes of all colors green, gray, blue, and black, and every movement and act of ours, walking, sitting, eating, reading, received its full share of never. The number of wives we left behind at home was also a constant theme of speculation among them, and shrewd guesses were sometimes made on this point, 250 being a favorite number. You could tell any amount of stories on this subject without exciting the slightest suspicion. Once, one of our number told a pretty waitress, I am awfully pleased with you, and I want to marry you. Will you accept the 40th wifeship in my household which became vacant just before I left my country? She asked, how many wives have you altogether? 250, the usual number, was the ready answer. What became of your wife, number 40? I killed her, because one morning she could not cook my porridge well. The poor girl was horrified, and exclaimed, oh you monster, oh you wretch. Then she narrated the sad fate of a friend of hers. She was a sweet little child, when an African student studying in Edinburgh came and wooed her. They got married in England and fondly loved each other. Everything went well as long as the pair lived in England, but after a short time he took his fair wife to his desert home in Liberia. Not a single white man or woman could she see there, and she felt very lonely. But the sight of her mother-in-law, who dressed in feathers and skins came dancing into the house half tipsy, was more than she could bear. She pined for a short time and died. Of course, every nation in the world considers other nations as savages or at least much inferior to itself. It was so from the beginning and it will be so. As long as human nature will retain its present character. We did not therefore Wonder that the common people should take us for barbarians, awkward as we were in every respect. They have very strict notions of dress, manners, and the general bearing of a man, any deviation from which is seriously noticed. Utmost indulgence was however shown to us everywhere. Her Majesty was graciously pleased to lay aside the usual rules, and this favor was shown us wherever we went. Gentlemen and ladies of high education and culture, however, honored us as the representatives of the most ancient nation now existing on the face of the earth. They would frequently ask us home, get up private parties and arrange for all sorts of amusements. In other houses we grew more intimate and formed part of the family party. To these we were always welcome, and could go and come whenever we liked. We got some friends among them, and these gentlemen would often come and fetch us home if we absented ourselves for more than the ordinary length of time. I fondly remember the happy days I passed with them, and feel thankful for the kindness they shewed me during my sojourn in their country. In public matters non-official gentlemen were also very partial to us. We want to hear the turbanned gentleman was the wish often and often expressed. But we ceased not to be a prodigious wonder to strangers and to the common people. Would they discuss us so freely if they knew that we understood their language? It was very amusing to hear what they said about us. Often when fatigued with work, or when cares and anxieties cast a gloom upon our mind, we found such talks about us more refreshing than a glass of port wine. I wish I had the ability to do justice to the discussing power of these ladies and gentlemen exercised in their kind notice of us, for in that case I could produce one of the most interesting books ever published. Or if T had known that I would be required to write an account of my visit to Europe, I would have taken notes of at least some of the remarkable hits on truth unconsciously made by ignorant people from the country, which are applicable to all nations and which set one to philosophies on the material difference that exists between our own estimate of ourselves and the estimate which others form of us. If we were interesting beings in the eyes of the Londoners, who had often opportunities of seeing their fellow subjects from the Far East, how much more would we be so to the simple villagers who came by thousands to see the wonders of the exhibition? Their conduct towards us was always kind and respectful. They liked to talk to us, and whenever convenient we tried to satisfy their curiosity. Men, women, and children, whose relations are in India serving as soldiers or in any other capacity, would come through the crowd, all panting, to shake hands with us and ask about their friends. Many queer incidents happened in this way. Do you know James Robinson you know of regiment, asked a fat elderly woman, who one day came bustling through the crowd and took me by storm, without any of those preliminary maneuvers usually adopted to open a conversation with a stranger. I expressed my regret in not having the honor of Jim's acquaintance. The good old lady then explained to me that she was Jim's aunt, and gave me a long history of her nephew, and the circumstances which led to his enlistment as a soldier. If the truant nephew lost the golden opportunity of sending through us his dutiful message to his aunt, she on her part was not wanting in her affectionate remembrances of him. Among other things, most of which I did not understand, for she did not speak the English we ordinarily hear nor was her language quite coherent at the time, she begged me to carry to Jim the important intelligence that Mrs. Jones' fat pig obtained a prize at the Smithfield Agricultural Show. I shewed my alacrity to carry the message right off to Jim in the wilds of Upper Burma by immediately taking leave of the lady, who joined her friends and explained to them that I was a bosom friend of her nephew. Once, I was sitting in one of the swellish, registered restaurants at the exhibition, glancing over a newspaper which I had no time to read in the morning. At a neighboring table sat a respectable-looking family group evidently from the country, from which furtive glances were occasionally thrown in my direction. I thought I might do worse than having a little fun, if any could be made out of the notice that was being taken of me. I seemed to be suddenly aware that I was being looked at, which immediately scared away half a dozen eyes from my table. It took fully 5 minutes deep undivided attention to my paper again to reassure and tempt out those eyes from the plates where they took refuge. And the glances from them, which at first flashed and flickered like lightning, became steadier the more my mind seemed to get absorbed in the subject I was reading. The closer inspection to which I submitted ended in my favor. Perhaps, no symptom being visible in my external appearance of the cannibalistic tendencies of my heart, or owing probably to the notion that I must have by that time got over my partiality for human flesh, or knowing at least that the place was safe enough against any treacherous spring which I might take into my head to make upon them, or owing to whatever other cause, the party gradually grew bolder, began to talk in whispers and actually tried to attract my attention towards them. The latter duty ultimately devolved upon the beauty of the party, a pretty girl of about 17. Of course it was not intended for my ears, but somehow I heard her say, "Oh, how I wish to speak to him." Could I withstand such an appeal? I rose and approaching a little curiosity asked, "Did you speak to me, young lady?" She blushed and hung down her head. Her papa came to the rescue. "My daughter, sir, is delighted with the magnificent things brought from your country to this exhibition. She saw some writing in your language on a few plates and shields, and is anxious to know its meaning. We did not know whom to ask, when we saw you. Will Ivo take a seat here, and do me the honor to take a glass of something with me? What will it be? Sparkling Moselle, asterisk I find is good here, or shall it be champagne or anything stronger?" he said. The proffered glass was declined with thanks, but I took a chair and explained the meaning of some of the verses damascened on the Kafkari ware. The young lady soon got over her bashfulness, and talked with a vivacity which I did not expect from her. She was delighted with everything I said, expressed her astonishment at my knowledge of English, and complimented me for the performance of the band brought from my country, viz., the West Indian band composed of Negroes and mulattoes, which compliment made me wince a little, but nevertheless I went on chattering for a quarter of an hour and furnishing her with sufficient means to annihilate her friend Minnie, Jane, or Lizzie or whoever she might be, and to brag among her less fortunate relations for 6 months to come of her having actually seen and talked to a genuine blackie. 1887. Joseph Chamberlain. Chamberlain, 1836–1914, was a manufacturer who made his fortune at the age of 38. He spent the rest of his life in politics, generally allying himself with radical causes. An enthusiastic promoter of imperial expansion and consolidation, he was appointed colonial secretary in 1895. The following selection is taken from a speech Chamberlain delivered in 1897 at the Royal Colonial Institute's annual dinner, published later that year in his foreign and colonial speeches. The text records the frequent cheers and laughter and expressions of agreement, here, that greeted his performance. From the true conception of empire. It seems to me that there are 3 distinct stages in our imperial history. We began to be, and we ultimately became, a great imperial power in the 18th century, but, during the greater part of that time, the colonies were regarded, not only by us, but by every European power that possessed them, as possessions valuable in proportion to the pecuniary advantage which they brought to the mother country which, under that order of ideas, was not truly a mother at all, but appeared rather in the light of a grasping and absentee landlord desiring to take From his tenants the utmost rents he could exact. The colonies were valued and maintained because it was thought that they would be a source of direct profit to the mother country. That was the first stage, and when we were rudely awakened by the War of Independence in America from this dream, that the colonies could be held for our profit alone, the second chapter was entered upon, and public opinion seems then to have drifted to the opposite extreme, and, because the colonies were no longer a source of revenue, it seems to have been believed and argued by many people that their separation from us was only a matter of time, and that separation should be desired and encouraged lest haply they might prove an encumbrance and a source of weakness. It was while those views were still entertained, while the Little Englanders registered, laughter, were in their full career, that this institute was founded to protest against doctrines so injurious to our interests, cheers, and so derogatory to our honor, and I rejoice that what was then, as it were, a voice crying in the wilderness, is now the expressed and determined will of the overwhelming majority of the British people. Loud cheers. Partly by the efforts of this institute and similar organizations, partly by the writings of such men as Froude and Seeley registered here, but mainly by the instinctive good sense and patriotism of the people at large, we have now reached the third stage in our history, and the true conception of our empire. Cheers. What is that conception? As regards the self-governing colonies *, we no longer talk of them as dependencies. The sense of possession has given place to the sentiment of kinship. We think and speak of them as part of ourselves. Cheers. As part of the British Empire, united to us, although they may be dispersed throughout the world, by ties of kindred, of religion, of history, and of language, and joined to us by the seas that formerly seemed to divide us. Cheers. But the British Empire is not confined to the self-governing colonies and the United Kingdom. It includes a much greater area, a much more numerous population in tropical climes, where no considerable European settlement is possible, and where the native population must always vastly outnumber the white inhabitants, and in these cases also the same change has come over the imperial idea. Here also the sense of possession has given place to a different sentiment, the sense of obligation. We feel now that our rule over these territories can only be justified if we can show that it adds to the happiness and prosperity of the people. Cheers, and I maintain that our rule does, and has, brought security and peace and comparative prosperity to countries that never knew these blessings before. Cheers. In carrying out this work of civilization we are fulfilling what I believe to be our national mission, and we are finding scope for the exercise of those faculties and qualities which have made of us a great governing race. Cheers. I do not say that our success has been perfect in every case, one do not say that all our methods have been beyond reproach, but I do say that in almost every instance in which the rule of the Queen has been established and the great Pax Britannicus has been enforced, there has come with it greater security to life and property, and a material improvement in the condition of the bulk of the population. Cheers. No doubt, in the first instance, when these conquests have been made, there has been bloodshed, there has been loss of life among the native populations, loss of still more precious lives among those who have been sent out to bring these countries into some kind of disciplined order, but it must be remembered that that is the condition of the mission we have to fulfill. You cannot have omelets without breaking eggs, you cannot destroy the practices of barbarism, of slavery, of superstition, which for centuries have desolate the interior of Africa, without the use of force, but if you will fairly contrast the gain to humanity with the price which we are bound to pay for it, think you may well rejoice in the result of such expeditions as those which have recently been conducted with such signal success. Cheers, in the Asaland, Ashanti, Benin, and Nook registered expeditions which may have, and indeed have, cost valuable lives, but as to which we may rest assured that for one life lost 100 will be gained, and the cause of civilization and the prosperity of the people will in the long run be eminently advanced. Cheers. But no doubt such a state of things, such a mission as I have described, involve heavy responsibility. In the wide dominions of the Queen the doors of the Temple of Janus are never closed, here, and it is a gigantic task that we have undertaken when we have determined to wield the scepter of empire. Great is the task, great is the responsibility, but great is the honor. Cheers, and I am convinced that the conscience and the spirit of the country will rise to the height of its obligations, and that we shall have the strength to fulfill the mission which our history and our national character have imposed upon us. Cheers. J. A. Hobson. John Atkinson Hobson, 1858–1940, the distinguished liberal economist and author, first taught classics and then worked as a lecturer in English literature and economics for the Oxford University Extension Delegacy and for the London Society for the Extension of University Teaching, before becoming a freelance writer. His many books include Problems of Poverty, 1891, The Evolution of Modern Capitalism, 1894, The Problem of the Unemployed, 1896, and John Ruskin, Social Reformer, 1898. From Imperialism, a Study. The Political Significance of Imperialism. The curious ignorance which prevails regarding the political character and tendencies of imperialism cannot be better illustrated than by the following passage from a learned work upon the history of colonization: The extent of British dominion may perhaps be better imagined than described, when the fact is appreciated that, of the entire land surface of the globe, approximately 1/5 is actually or theoretically under that flag, while more than 1/6 of all the human beings living in this planet reside under one or the other type of English colonization. The names by which authority is exerted are numerous, and processes are distinct, but the goals to which this manifold mechanism is working are very similar. According to the climate, the natural conditions and the inhabitants of the regions affected, procedure and practice differ. The means are adapted to the situation, there is not any irrevocable, immutable line of policy. From time to time, from decade to decade, English statesmen have applied different treatments to the same territory. Only one fixed rule of action seems to exist: it is to promote the interests of the colony to the utmost, to develop its scheme of government as rapidly as possible, and eventually to elevate it from the position of inferiority to that of association. Under the charm of this beneficent spirit, the chief colonial establishments of Great Britain have already achieved substantial freedom, without dissolving nominal ties. The other subordinate possessions are aspiring to it, while, on the other hand, this privilege of local independence has enabled England to assimilate with these many feudatory states too into the body politic of her system. Here then is the theory that Britons are a race endowed, like the Romans, with a genius for government, that our colonial and imperial policy is animated by a resolve to spread throughout the world the arts of free self-government which we enjoy at home, and that in truth we are accomplishing this work. Now, without discussing here the excellencies or the defects of the British theory and practice of representative self-government, to assert that our fixed rule of action has been to educate our dependencies in this theory and practice is quite the largest misstatement of the facts of our colonial and imperial policy that is possible. Upon the vast majority of the populations throughout Our empire we have bestowed no real powers of self-government, nor have we any serious intention of doing so, or any serious belief that it is possible for us to do so. Of the 367 millions of British subjects outside these isles, not more than 10 millions, or 1 in 37, have any real self-government for purposes of legislation and administration. Political freedom, and civil freedom, so far as it rests upon the other, are simply non-existent for the overwhelming majority of British subjects. In the self-governing colonies of Australasia and North America alone is responsible representative government a reality, and even their considerable populations of outlanders for as in West Australia, or servile labour, as in Queensland, temper the genuineness of democracy. In Cape Colony and Natal recent events 5 testify how feebly the forms and even the spirit of the free British institutions have taken root in states where the great majority of the population were always excluded from political rights. The franchise and the rights it carries will remain virtually a white monopoly in so-called self-governing colonies, where the coloured population is to the white as 4 to 1 and 10 to 1 respectively. In certain of our older crown colonies there exists a representative element in the government. While the administration is entirely vested in a governor, appointed by the Crown, assisted by a council nominated by him, the colonists elect a portion of the Legislative Assembly. The following colonies belong to this order: Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Bahamas, British Guiana, Windward Islands, Bermudas, Malta, Mauritius, Ceylon. The representative element differs considerably in size and influence in these colonies, but nowhere does it outnumber the non-elected element. It thus becomes an advisory rather than a really legislative factor. Not merely is the elected always dominated in numbers by the non-elected element, but in all cases the veto of the colonial office is freely exercised upon measures passed by the assemblies. To this it should be added that in nearly all cases a fairly high property qualification is attached to the franchise, precluding the colored people from exercising an elective power proportionate to their number bears and their stake in the country. The entire population of these modified crown colonies amounted to 5,700,000 in 1898.6. The overwhelming majority of the subjects of the British Empire are under crown colony government, or under protectorates. In neither case do they enjoy any of the important political rights of British citizens, in neither case are they being trained in the arts of free British institutions. In the crown colony the population exercises no political privileges. The governor, appointed by the colonial office, is absolute, alike for legislation and administration. He is aided by a council of local residents usually chosen by himself or by home authority, but its function is merely advisory, and its advice can be and frequently is ignored. In the vast protectorates we have assumed in Africa and Asia there is no tincture of British representative government. The British factor consists in arbitrary acts of irregular interference with native government. Exceptions to this exist in the case of districts assigned to chartered companies, where business men, animated avowedly by business ends, are permitted to exercise arbitrary powers of government over native populations under the imperfect check of some British imperial commissioner. Again, in certain native and feudatory states of India our empire is virtually confined to government of foreign relations, military protection, and a veto upon grave internal disorder, the real administration of the countries being left in the hands of native princes or headmen. However excellent this arrangement may be, it lends little support to the general theory of the British Empire as an educator of free political institutions. Where British government is real, it does not carry freedom or self-government. Where it does carry a certain amount of freedom and self-government, it is not real. Not 5% of the population of our empire are possessed of any appreciable portion of the political and civil liberties which are the basis of British civilization. Outside the 10 millions of British subjects in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, no considerable body is endowed with full self-government in the more vital matters, or is being elevated from the position of inferiority to that of association. This is the most important of all facts for students of the present and probable future of the British Empire. We have taken upon ourselves in these little islands the responsibility of governing huge aggregations of lower races in all parts of the world by methods which are antithetic to the methods of government which we most value for ourselves. 1902